I'm going to say good evening again. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Allison Hodgkins. I'm the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council of Maine, and I want to thank everyone for coming to our Fall Foreign Policy Forum, which is sponsored by the William S. Jelen Foundation and in partnership with the Muskie School of Public Service. You may have noticed it's winter, not fall, no longer fall. We're meeting tonight because the tragedy in Lewiston necessitated that we reschedule this event. In other words, we had to postpone discussing the awful carnage in the Holy Land because of the carnage right here at home. And I would like to pause to remember all the innocent lives lost here and there. May their memories be a blessing. Tonight, however, we're gathered to discuss something that should not be unimaginable: peace. Peace in the Middle East. Peace between Arab and Jew, peace between Israel and the Palestinians. The panelists that we have here tonight know how difficult it is to reach that word. They have dedicated their careers to its pursuit as diplomats working in the name of the United States of America. Gentlemen, thank you for your service. And as a side note, we spoke with Senator Mitchell by phone today, and he said he believed that if these three men could be sent back, perhaps we would be getting on the right path. Just so you know who we have here, we're really privileged. I'll start with our moderator, Ambassador David Pierce. I should say our own Ambassador David Pierce, who's a member of our advisory board, a Maine native, Cheverus grad, and Bowdoin grad. Ambassador Pierce was a journalist in Beirut before he joined the Foreign Service. He's an Arabist and an artist, and he served as the Deputy Chief of Mission in Afghanistan, Ambassador to Algeria and Greece, and most importantly for tonight's conversation, as Consul General and Chief of Mission in Jerusalem from 2003 to 2005, which was during the height of the Second Intifada. He was followed by, in 2005, our next panelist, Ambassador Jay Wallace, who stayed there twice as long as Ambassador Pierce, from 2005 until 2009, dates which cover some of the most consequential developments in Gaza and efforts to restart the peace process during the George W. Bush administration. Ambassador Wallace was also the U.S. Ambassador to Tunisia and is now a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. And finally, we have Ambassador Daniel Kurtzer, who I know as a trustee of the American University of Cairo, but he was also our ambassador to Egypt and our ambassador to Israel, where he overlapped with both Ambassador Pierce and Ambassador Wallace. Most importantly, he also played an instrumental role in the negotiations that brought about the 1991 Madrid Conference as a member of then Secretary of State James Baker's staff. Madrid, of course, was the first time that Israel came together in the same room with representatives of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the Palestinians. These impressive records of service mean something crucial, something that should be not overlooked, and why we have this forum. As diplomats working on the peace process, they have spent their careers talking with all of the parties to the conflict, all of the stakeholders, Israel, Egypt, the Palestinians. But more importantly, they spent their careers listening to them, hearing them, and understanding what they need to make peace a reality. Because as our guests know, peace is achieved by creating solutions and formulas that provide the parties with not all, not most, but enough of what they need. Before I hand things over to Ambassador Pierce, who will be our moderator this evening, I want to stop to thank the William S. Jelen Foundation for sponsoring tonight's program. William S. Dillon was a successful entrepreneur and businessman and someone who believed in the cause of peace in the Middle East. He left us much too soon. And his foundation, we have some of the board members here, Mr. Harold Pacious and Mr. Ryan Mayhew, who graciously helped us get this grant so we could achieve and bring all of you here tonight to listen and to learn. I also want to thank, of course, the University of Southern Maine, Perusa Pavri, Associate Dean of the Muskie School of Public Service, who is our partners. I also want to thank all of the members of the World Affairs Council of Maine, all of the individuals who came forward with additional sponsorship, and also those who, Thomas Mosier, who graciously gave us this wonderful set, which we're not going to spill anything on. And in particular, I want to thank those of you who gave contributions to support our student ticket fund. We have at least 15 students here from Gould Academy and the University of Southern Maine. One of the most important things we do as the World Affairs Council of Maine is encourage young Mainers to be curious about our interconnected world. But I have spoken enough. I'd like to turn things over to our panelists. Thank you.
Over to me.
Over to you, David. Yeah.
Okay. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Even in the back?
Yes.
Thanks, Allison. And thanks to all of you for coming. It looks like a great crowd. It's such an honor to be here with the support of the World Affairs Council and the William S. Dillon Foundation and the Muskie School of Public Service here at the University of Maine, Southern Maine. It's a particular honor for me to welcome two friends and colleagues from Foreign Service. When I was Consul General in Jerusalem, I think Dan and I were on the phone almost every day for 2 years. And when I left, Jake came, stayed twice as long as I did. And so he is really deeply versed in the issues that we're going to talk about. So Dan and Jake, welcome to me. It's been 60 days now since October 7. Thousands of people have died. Thousands have been injured. Images of the dead and the dying and the hostages and the hostage families and the reports of rape and the ruination and the sight of children with shrapnel wounds. It's really been pretty searing. And I think it's fair to say it's an event that has convulsed not just Gaza and Israel, but the wider Middle East and indeed the world. And I think it's an event that's going to have long-term knock-on effects that we can only really guess at right now. So tonight we're going to try and take a look at some of how this came about and about what might or might not come next. But before we turn to October 7, I'd like to look back 28 years to September 1995. That was a more hopeful time. In September 1995, Israel had peace treaties with Egypt and Jordan. The Oslo Accords had spelled out a plan for expansion of Palestinian self-rule with a pathway via a 5-year transition period to discussions on all the so-called final status issues, including Jerusalem, refugees, borders, security arrangements, and settlements. It seemed that the only thing left to do was tie up an accord with Syria and finalize those discussions between Israel and the Palestinians. It looked at the time like the Israeli-Palestinian track of the peace process really, at long last, was producing some results. And then things fell apart. And I would like to get a brief perspective, both from Ambassador Kurtzer and Ambassador Wallace, about how all that happened before we move on to October 7th. Why don't we start? Hello. Yeah, why don't we start with you? Welcome again, and can you give us our thoughts on what happened?
Well, thank you to all of you for coming to World Affairs Council
How about now? So, thank you to all of you and to the World Affairs Council for the invitation. One of the things that binds the three of us alongside our friendship is the fact that we all served at the same time during the Second Palestinian Intifada or uprising. And we had a taste of what now everyone is experiencing in these past 60 days, when Palestinians seeking to end the Israeli occupation rose up, acts of violence and terrorism, Israel in response attacked Palestinians, and we had a little bit of a foretaste of what we're experiencing. And I know we're going to come to that, but I thought it was important to set the stage that what we are seeing has a long tail. In the mid-1990s, we thought we had the leadership, both in Israel and in Palestine, that would translate the promise of the Madrid Peace Conference and the promise of the Oslo Accords that followed the peace conference about 2 years later into peace treaties. On the way back from Madrid, in fact, the Secretary of State Baker came to our section of the airplane and said that he was going to be leaving the State Department shortly to go to the White House to run President George H.W. Bush's re-election campaign. But he said he would come back to the State Department after President Bush was re-elected, and we would sign peace treaties. And all of us, I considered us pretty hardened diplomats, absolutely believed that that was the case. We thought we had found the key that unlocked the door of peace in the Middle East. But one of the characteristics of that mid-1995 period is, number one, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin by a right-wing Israeli extremist opposed to what Israel was doing with the Palestinians. It was the unwillingness, maybe inability of the PLO leader Yasser Arafat to take the steps necessary to translate the promise of Madrid and Oslo into reality. It was bad behaviors, bad actions by both sides, continuation of Israeli settlement activity, which was eating up the very land that was supposed to be part of the negotiations leading to a Palestinian state that would live side by side in peace and security with the state of Israel. It was onerous occupation practices, checkpoints, and other activities in the occupied territories that made life miserable for Palestinians. It was Palestinian violence and terrorism, in contradiction to the commitments they had made to forego violence and terrorism. It was the continuation of what's called incitement in their public statements, questioning whether or not the recognition that they had offered Israel in 1993 was real or was a tactic. So on the one hand, you had these breakthroughs, which should have created conditions for leaders to translate those breakthroughs into the reality of peace. But you then had continuation of behaviors on the ground that undercut the possibility of making progress. Last point I'd make is, you asked the question, or you can ask the question, well, why didn't leaders get a hold of this situation? You know, there's this great man theory of history, and I don't know the answer to that. The leader that succeeded Yitzhak Rabin in Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, who is now still the Prime Minister of Israel, was uninterested in moving forward the Oslo Agreement and moving forward toward a two-state solution. The Palestinian leadership never really committed itself to the kind of active peace process that might have succeeded. A few years after 1995, when President Bill Clinton convened a summit, the then Prime Minister of Israel, Ehud Barak, actually made an interesting offer. It wasn't 100% of what the Palestinians would have wanted, but it was an interesting starting point. And Yasser Arafat really wasn't ready to talk about the two most critical issues on his agenda, the Palestinian refugee issue and Jerusalem. And so I always turn to this question of leadership. Can we have a situation in which leaders in Israel, in Palestine, and in Washington all come together and figure out how to make this conflict go away.
Thanks to Dan for that overview. And he, by the way, took part in a lot of this stuff, particularly in the Madrid Peace Conference and its aftermath. Jake, what's your perspective on what happened after September 1995 and the assassination of Rabin from the Palestinian point of view?
First of all, thanks to the World Affairs Council for organizing this event tonight. Thanks to all of you in the audience for coming out on a cold evening in Maine to talk about this issue. I'll pick up the Palestinian side of things from where Dan was talking about how extremists on both sides work to derail the process. On the Palestinian side, it was mostly terrorism, and it was mostly coming from Hamas. And I want to focus on Hamas, even though there were actions by the Palestinian Authority and Arafat and others over the years that contributed to the collapse of the process. But Hamas played a critical role, I think, in undermining support among Palestinians and Israelis for peace. And I point to a couple of periods. David, you spoke about 1995, and that was the moment in the mid-90s when Hamas evolved from an organization that was focused in some respects on the future and on Islamic principles into a more of a terrorist organization that organized bus bombings and restaurant attacks that killed large numbers of Israelis. This was in the mid-90s. Those attacks, I think, were instrumental in turning the Israeli public off the idea of peace with Palestinians. And the bombings in the early part of 1996, I think, helped contribute to the election of Netanyahu, and that election had Shimon Peres. And that ushered in a shift to the right in Israeli politics. It continues more or less to this time. The second moment where Hamas played a spoiler role was in 2007, when after the elections that Hamas won, in the end of that government, and I'll go into the details of that a little bit later, but Hamas forcibly took over Gaza at that point and expelled the Palestinian Authority from Gaza and introduced the split that we see to this day between a Gaza that's run by Hamas and the West Bank that's run by the Palestinian Authority. That really undermined the ability of the PLO and the Palestinian Authority and Abbas to negotiate credibly with Israel. It was impossible for him to speak on behalf of the entire Palestinian population at that point. And that, I think, was a critical factor in the inability of negotiations to take off after then. And the third moment, which is where we're coming out now, is October 7th. Now again, Hamas played this critical role in this attack on Israel and undermining any support in Israel.
Well, thanks to both of you. Thanks to both of you for taking a few minutes to fill us in on the withering away of Oslo. I think it's worth remembering because it was such a serious effort at moving the parties towards a two-state solution. And the other thing that I take away from that is that for a very long time now, there hasn't really been much of a peace process. And nothing good happens in that situation. And basically, what has happened, and you just heard an exposition of it, is that the political vacuum has strengthened the position of rejectionists on both sides. And with that, I'd like to go back to October 7th. From the beginning, having trouble with this button. You know, the first thing I'd like to talk about is how we got here, and then a little bit later we'll talk about what happens when the dust settles. So in terms of how we got here, Dan, a big question from the start has been, why didn't Israel see this coming?
You know, instead of watching I think it was Tom Hanks' movie, The Perfect Storm, you can look at the October 7th situation. A perfect storm of failure on the part of political leadership in Israel, intelligence, and operational military activities. I start with political leadership because for about 10 years leading up to October, the Prime Minister Netanyahu had made a calculation that it was more beneficial for him to deal with Hamas in order not to have to deal with the PLO, which was demanding Israel's withdrawal from territories that it occupied in 1967. Netanyahu was of a political ideology and represents a right-wing view within Israel that would like to hold on to those territories, ultimately to annex those territories. And so having to deal with the PLO for Netanyahu constituted a contradiction to his basic ideology. In Hamas, he thought he had found a quote-unquote partner. He knew that Hamas was a terrorist organization. He knew that Hamas's charter called for the destruction of the state of Israel. But in informal third-party contacts with Hamas, he came to believe, that Hamas would be satisfied with governing in Gaza, periodically launching rockets to burnish their credentials as a resistance organization, but basically not interested in a long-term conflict or a long-term peace process. And Netanyahu created this artifice of absolutely absurd views about Hamas that pervaded the Israeli system before October. I'll tell you one quick story going back to the 1980s, because I was stationed in Israel as a more junior officer in the 1980s, and one of my responsibilities was covering the situation in Gaza and reporting on Gaza. I traveled to Gaza every week for 4 years. Got to know the situation on the ground pretty well, enough that I would go in to see the military government back in Tel Aviv and ask why they were promoting the precursor of Hamas, the Islamic fundamentalist movement, and denying funding and so forth to the nationalists. And finally, about a year into my 4-year tour of duty, the military governor admitted that, well, these folks are religious, they're okay. The other folks actually want an independent state. So this has a long tail, this idea that somehow this organization, which has been upfront in its desire to destroy the state of Israel, can actually become a partner. Political failure, intelligence failure. We now know, for those of you who have seen the New York Times just a few days ago, that Israel's intelligence did not fail. It was the intelligence conclusions that failed, because they had a copy of Hamas's operational plan. They had it about a year ago. They also had young women manning stations, intelligence stations, listening and watching through aerial surveillance, who were telling the officers up the chain of command that things were happening in Gaza that were worrisome. In fact, there's one story which has credibility. One of these women soldiers finally got a meeting with a fairly senior military intelligence official. She reported what she was seeing, which we now know what she was seeing. She was seeing practice runs at what happened on October 7th. And the commander apparently told her not to report anymore because it wasn't going to happen. Israel intelligence had become captive of a concept, almost like, if you remember 1973, there was a concept in 1973 that said, Egypt has the capability of attacking Israel, but it doesn't have the intention to attack Israel. The same thing happened in the intelligence community before October 7th. And this officer told this woman soldier, female soldier, if you persist in making these reports, you might be subject to a court-martial. Okay? So are you going to continue issuing those reports under threat of a court-martial? So the intelligence community had the information, they just failed. But you also had an operational military failure. In order to protect settlers, the settlements in the West Bank, the Gaza Brigade was denuded in the period before October 7th. at least 2 battalions, perhaps more, of the Gaza Brigade were transferred to the West Bank on the eve of the holiday. October 7th was not only the Jewish Sabbath, but it was also a Jewish holiday. They were transferred to the West Bank to protect settlers on the assumption that Palestinians in the West Bank might try something. And so the security arrangement that Israel had around Gaza, an electrified fence that would provide a warning of a possible breach, a number of outposts that should have been manned on the presumption that you need to have eyes and ears watching, they were empty. Israel had also withdrawn some weapons from the local guards in the kibbutzim and moshavim around Gaza in order to move them into the West Bank settlements. You could not have written this script more perfectly than what Hamas faced. Hamas didn't know this was going to happen. We're pretty sure they didn't know about the rave, this event in which upwards of 240 young people who had gone to a music festival were caught in the horror of and the barbarism of the barbaric attack. They probably didn't know about it, but they did find almost an open door. Political, intelligence, and operational failures. At the same time, in the same place, an open door to Hamas terrorists to come in and do absolutely horrible things. David alluded to some of them. There's now additional information coming out about rapes, beheadings, what was done to children, the kidnapping of babies, taken hostage. Unbelievable stuff that occurred as a result of failures on the part of the political, intelligence, and military community in the state of Israel.
Dan, one follow-up. How realistic? Can you all hear me?
No.
And now? Okay. How realistic is Israel's stated war aim, the destruction of Hamas?
The answer is it isn't. Hamas is not a uniformed army that's ready to come out and fight on the battlefield and the winner takes all. Hamas is a fundamentalist religious movement. Some of its operatives do wear characteristic clothes. We've seen that in video, kind of black garb and a black balaclava and so forth. But it's a religious movement. It encompasses a large segment of the community in Gaza that adheres to the religious ideals of Hamas, if not necessarily the terroristic ideals. It has following in the West Bank and has following in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon and elsewhere. So the assumption or the anticipation that this can be quote unquote destroyed is a war aim that can't be fulfilled. What Israel might try to do and might actually accomplish is to decapitate the Hamas leadership to a great extent and to debilitate their ability to continue to pose an immediate threat. Israel also can largely prevent Hamas from resuming governance in Gaza. Those are hard war aims to achieve, but the aim of destroying Hamas is a bridge too far.
Jake, hello? Jake, there you are. Tell us about Hamas and how it got into a position to carry out this operation, and what is Hamas's war aim?
Okay, the short history of Hamas, which starts in 1987. Hamas, by the way, is an Arabic acronym which stands for Islamic Resistance Movement. They were founded in 1987 at the start of the first Intifada, the first Palestinian uprising against Israel. they espouse an ideology that is a mixture of armed resistance against Israel and political Islam. And those are the two pillars of the organization. But Hamas has evolved over time. In the beginning, I think, as the military governor told you all those years ago, they were religious people. They were focused more on religious objectives, good deeds, social welfare, that sort of thing. Over time, they began to shift more of the armed resistance aspect of their ideology, and they developed their capabilities to attack Israel. Hamas's objective, broadly speaking, is the elimination of Israel and the replacement of Israel and all the land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea with an Islamist Palestinian state. They don't believe in a two-state solution, and they believe in the use of armed resistance or terrorism to accomplish their objective. In the beginning, as I said, they were focused more on religious objectives. They did carry out attacks against Israel, but mostly in the West Bank and in Gaza, and mostly directed at the army. It wasn't until the mid-90s that I alluded to earlier when they began to take the attacks in Israel and went after civilian targets, the buses, the restaurants, the coffee shops. And they had that impact of derailing the beginnings of the Oslo process. Later on, in 2006, for the first time, Hamas decided to field candidates for the Palestinian legislative elections. These were the elections in 2006, where Hamas got 46% of the vote, the majority of the seats in the Legislative Council. And as a result, they were asked to form a government. That government was boycotted by Israel, was boycotted by the United States and the rest of the international community, but was never able to function properly. And after about a year of back and forth, President Abbas, who had been elected himself in 2005, dismissed the Hamas government, replaced it with a non-Hamas government, mostly Fatah members and some independents. Hamas reacted to that by forcibly expelling the PA from Gaza, taking over Gaza and establishing its own separate government in Gaza. That was the beginning of the bifurcation between Gaza and the West Bank, between Hamas and Fatah. What that also did is it gave Hamas for the first time control of territory. And that allowed Hamas to develop its military capabilities. First, starting with the rockets that they developed with Iranian help that they used to attack Israel. That led to successive conflicts between Israel and Hamas in 2009, 2014, 2021. After each of these wars with Israel, Hamas lost the battle, but emerged intact, not intact, but emerged able to rebuild itself, and over time grew stronger. What we now know is that after 2021, they began to develop these plans to stage a cross-border attack in Israel, as we've seen on October the 7th. While they were doing that, building their capabilities, they engaged in a deception campaign to convince Israel that they were more interested in the economic benefits of workers working in Israel, with the money coming in from Qatar, and that they wouldn't attack Israel. That deception campaign, plus their improved capabilities, and all the failures on the Israeli side that Dan described, contributed to what happened on October the 7th.
Jake, just one follow-up. How much support do you think Hamas has, not only in Gaza, but also in the West Bank? And also, how do you see this going in the West Bank?
Well, it's hard to gauge. I mean, they haven't had an election since 2006 when Hamas got 44% of the vote. There are opinion polls. I think there's a variation between their support in Gaza and their support in the West Bank. Ironically, they have more support in the West Bank than in Gaza, and the PA has more support, and Abbas has more support in Gaza than in the West Bank. I think that reflects the fact that Palestinian people generally don't like their government, and if they're ruled by Hamas, they would rather have the other side rule, and if they're ruled by the Palestinian Authority, they would rather have Hamas rule. So it's hard to gauge, and it's also been affected by what's happened since October 7th. I think in Gaza, Hamas's support has declined, in part because of the suffering that people are enduring, and they blame, at least in part, on Hamas, although most of the blame goes to Israel. In the West Bank, Hamas's popularity has gone up. Hamas has succeeded in getting Israel to release Palestinian prisoners in return for the release of the hostages. Most of those prisoners reside in the West Bank. They've been released into the West Bank. And that's increased Hamas's popularity in the West Bank.
Yeah, I'll just add that when I was consul general in Jerusalem and Yasser Arafat died and Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, became his successor as president, head of the Palestinian Authority, the one thing he really wanted was release of prisoners, because almost every family in the West Bank is touched by this in some way or another. And he was repeatedly spurned by Prime Minister Sharon on that. And eventually, I think that led to his delegitimization in large part, and to the growth of Hamas. Because Hamas, the Palestinian Authority, was seen to have failed.
Well,
We've looked at Israel's war aims and Hamas's war aims. Why don't we, in the time we've got left, turn to what happens when the dust settles? If you spend a lot of time in the Middle East, you realize that no matter how bad things get, they can always get worse. And that may well happen here. But let's assume that someday, somehow, this war comes to an end. So how does each party see the day after and what needs to be done? Dan, why don't we start with you and Israel and Israelis?
Well, I'll actually start with Washington, because it's our government that's doing the only serious thinking about the day after. We're trying to promote such thinking in Palestine and in Israel, but as I understand it, we're not getting much feedback. We're hearing from the Israeli leadership, from Netanyahu and some members of his cabinet, that they're thinking about a long-term presence in Gaza, creation of security zones. Some members of his government are actually talking about resettling parts of Gaza, at least in part. Netanyahu just recently suggested that he would not allow the Palestinian Authority to return to Gaza, doesn't trust it. So there's a hard line that's being proposed by the Israeli government, which is in line with its war aims. If you think you can destroy Hamas, then you have free rein to do anything you want. I think the administration is pushing back, not out of love or respect for Hamas, but out of the belief that the idea of Hamas 2.0, will probably survive this war, and one needs to think about how you actually govern the Gaza Strip after the war, and who provides security. The Arab states have been clear that they're not interested in cleaning up the mess. Arab states have made clear that they're not interested in taking over governance. And the Palestinian Authority has been amazingly quiet during this period, failing to step forward with any kind of an articulation of an idea of what it wants to do, or it plans to do, or what it's capable of doing. And so I go back to where I started, which is the thinking is being done in Washington. They're reaching out to think tanks and academics outside of government for ideas. And those ideas fall into two main categories. One, obviously, is the reconstruction of Gaza, the rehabilitation of the housing and the infrastructure and electricity and water and basic needs. And the other is it time to get to the underlying issue which divides Israelis and Palestinians, and that is the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and the idea of getting to a two-state outcome in which both sides can achieve self-determination and independent statehood in a secure environment. these are hard ideas to implement. The logical part of that equation needs to get done, but the question is going to be who does it. The international community is fatigued by requirements of funding conflict areas, Ukraine, for example, Yemen, other areas where international funding has been required. Arab states, as I noted, don't want to become the policemen of Gaza. Palestinian Authority, I'll let Jake talk to this more, but Palestinian Authority doesn't really even govern in the West Bank. It's fairly dysfunctional. Has been an election, as we noted, since 2006, and is not ready, would not be ready on the day after the fighting to take over. So a lot of this is going to fall on President Biden's shoulders, and we're in an election year where hard decisions about domestic politics and our own border security and continued support for the effort to push back Russian aggression in Ukraine and Chinese muscling themselves into what may be a crisis over the next period in South China Sea or vis-a-vis Taiwan. The president has an amazing agenda in an election year, and to think about what he might have to carry in order to advance the prospect both of Gaza reconstruction and the peace process is a challenge.
Jake, what about Hamas and the Palestinians and the day after, if that day comes? You know, the Biden administration has said they would like to see the Palestinian Authority step in, but as Dan points out, there are obvious problems with that. You wonder, are they even able to? And if they did, what kind of top cover would they need?
Well, I'll start with Hamas, and then I'll talk about the Palestinian Authority. But, in the case of Hamas, I think this is about their survival. And as long as there's any remnant of Hamas left, which there will be, because I agree with Dan, the Israelis can't destroy Hamas completely, they will declare that they won. And they will, as Secretary of Defense Austin said the other day, they will turn a tactical defeat into a strategic victory. I'm afraid that Israel will continue pursuing Hamas indefinitely, essentially, until, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, Israel is not prepared to give up security control in Gaza and intends to retain overall responsibility for Gaza's security. That will lead to an ongoing fight with Hamas that could go on for a long, long time. In that circumstance, I think Gaza is essentially ungovernable. Hamas won't be in a position to govern it. No one else is going to come in and take over while Israel continues to maintain security responsibility in Gaza. Palestinian Authority, as you said, is not well positioned. They're not very effective as a government in the West Bank. President Abbas is not very popular. They're not really well liked anywhere. So the idea, and they don't have the forces to go into Gaza and exercise security responsibility at the moment either. Egypt and Jordan are not going to solve this problem for Israel. There's no NATO or UN force that's going to come in and do that. So I think you have a situation where Gaza is essentially ungovernable for a long time. The UN will be there to provide humanitarian assistance, basically keep the people alive. But until Israel develops some sort of exit strategy and figures out a way to get out of this bind, this can continue for a long, long time.
I remember when I was in Jerusalem, I had a conversation with Saab Erekat, who was the lead Palestinian negotiator at the time. And he was, I think, being genuinely puzzled. He said, David, don't the Israelis understand? Don't you in the United States understand that if we, the secular nationalists, lose, the alternative is Hamas and the Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic fundamentalism, and that will have enormous implications for the whole region. And of Of course, that's a big question, still is. But the question really is it possible that there will be a paradigm shift in Israel to recognize that it's not practical to support Hamas? I mean, this appears to be a huge defeat for the Netanyahu approach with Hamas, but then what?
One of the things that we do when we're analyzing these situations is to understand narratives. It was putting ourselves into the shoes of the people that we're studying or with whom we're interacting. And I think that's one of the things to do in this case. None of us really understands the trauma and anger and anguish that Israelis felt after October 7th. Now, I can say the same thing about the anguish and anger and trauma of Palestinians in Gaza since October 7th. But answering the question about Israel, we don't know what long-term impact this will have on a population that feels as besieged and as let down by its own government and its own military as the Israeli people feel now. In contacts I've had with friends, former colleagues, and others in Israel, they say that we don't understand. Intellectually, we might, but we don't understand how they feel when they watched, was it 13 or 14 communities get invaded and destroyed, and the people butchered, and those who lived taken into captivity inside Israel as a result of the failures. And they believe we don't understand that those living in the northern part of Israel have been dislocated from their homes under the threat of Hezbollah, which we haven't even talked about tonight. A much more potent organization than Hamas could aspire to be, with 1,000 more rockets than Hamas had ever accumulated, and battle-hardened, having participated in the Syrian civil war. So to think about how Israelis will assess their own situation in the aftermath of this trauma is extraordinarily difficult. On the one hand, one can hope that after 56 years of occupation, Israelis will say, as the question implies, we tried something, it didn't work, enough is enough. We've got to give Palestinians self-determination and independent statehood. Or, as happened after the second Intifada, period when we were all serving in that area, the whole population says, we can never live with these people, and therefore we will have to control them, even through violence, in order to live our own lives. And I don't know what answer the Israeli people will provide. The argument I'm making with our administration is we have a role to play here. President Biden has created significant amount of space to offer advice to Israel because of the support he's given them. It's cost him a great deal among various segments of our own population and internationally. The question is, will he use the space he created to help move Israel, the Israeli public opinion, towards the right outcome, which is end the occupation, accept the idea that an independent Palestinian state needs to be created, not just for their well-being, but for Israel's ultimate security.
I just want to make one point on the Israeli side. Since October the 7th, the political debate in Israel has not been about what to do with the Palestinians. It's been about which of the two war aims to emphasize. Is it destroying Hamas or is it getting the hostages released? One camp, which was I think most of the government right now, wants to focus on destroying Hamas and not prioritize the release of the hostages. The other side of the debate, led by the hostages' families, wants to de-emphasize the military aspect and get focused on negotiation of hostage release. That is the debate going on in Israel right now. debate is not about what to do with the Palestinians, it's not about this long-term problem. And I think Dan is right that the Israelis are not going to focus on this problem themselves. There's a long history of Israel, particularly the Netanyahu governments, trying to kick this can down the road, postpone a debate, try to buy time. And I think the United States, as Dan was saying, play a role sort of jump-starting that process of beginning to have this shift in what the debate is in Israel, the Palestinian issue, and what to do.
I'd like to get back in a minute to the U.S. role in possible peace process and so forth. But before we do, I think it'd be good to hear from both of you on the regional fallout. This is it's spreading into the West Bank, and it's also American troops in Syria and Iraq have been attacked by Iranian proxies. The Houthis have lobbed missiles at commercial shipping in the Red Sea, which is not going to do anything good for insurance rates. And Iran so far has been quiet. Hezbollah has so far been quiet. What if it goes on? What if it spreads? How do you guys see the regional reaction unfolding and the implications for our interests there?
Well, as you know, right after October 7th, we took a number of steps to provide some deterrence to what was anticipated to be an expansion of the war. We moved two aircraft carrier battle groups to the Eastern Mediterranean. We moved some other forces. We have pushed back against the Houthi missile attacks, although we have not retaliated for them yet. Our purpose was, having looked at the possible escalatory options out there, how do you prevent a widening of the war? In other words, how do you prevent Hezbollah from deciding to step in behalf of Hamas when Hamas is facing pressure from Israeli attacks in Gaza? How do you prevent Iran from using its other proxies, as they are using other proxies, to try to goad Israel into a wider war? And that's still a possibility. There's no question that any of these fronts can explode at any moment, either consciously or unintentionally. An errant missile from a rocket from Hezbollah that hits a school in northern Israel, an errant Israeli missile that hits the Lebanese school, will immediately trigger a wider conflict. And we saw that in 2006. Hezbollah tried to kidnap some Israeli soldiers in an effort to trade those kidnapped soldiers for imprisoned Lebanese prisoners. And Israel didn't react the way Hezbollah thought they would react. Israel decided to attack, and we had a very significant war in 2006. So these escalatory possibilities are not theoretical, they're real. And there's an additional one, which frankly no one has anticipated, but may end up being the most serious, and that is a wider war in the West Bank. Israeli settlers, extremist settlers, sometimes under cover of the Israeli army, have been attacking Palestinian civilians. Upwards of 200 have been killed. Those numbers pale in significance to the numbers that we're hearing about casualties. But the West Bank hadn't been involved in the attack on Israel. And we've heard from former Prime Minister Olmert, for example, who suggested that the settlers are actually interested in fomenting trouble in the West Bank so that Israel can clamp down even further in order to promote their aims of annexation. So these escalation scenarios are quite serious. In the face of those, if I could take one more minute, a lot of focus has turned to Egypt. I wrote a piece in the New York Times a few weeks ago trying to explain the conundrum that Egypt faced in dealing with this problem. On the one hand, Egypt has a border with Gaza, and is looked to by the international community as the conduit for humanitarian assistance. What Egypt doesn't want, though, is humanitarian assistance going in and Palestinians being forced out. They don't want a second exodus of Palestinian refugees. Egypt is also not a rich country, doesn't want the responsibility for Palestinians who end up in Egypt. And so you have a very watching brief on the part of the Egyptian leadership. We know that the Jordanian king is extraordinarily upset by what's happening. He recalled his ambassador from Israel and told the Israeli ambassador to Jordan not to return to post, which is kind of a minimum step that you can take. Ambassadors are disposable, after all. We know that from our own experience. But the king is looking at his domestic situation. Jordan has not had a census in probably 70 years and is a majority Palestinian state. And therefore, the upheaval, uproar in Jordan is serious. The king needs to take it into account. So the regional situation is fraught and will remain that way as long as the intensity of the war continues.
Jake? Any other thoughts on that? I mean, one thing that occurs to me is Abraham Accords. What do you think will happen with that?
Well, first, I agree with all of what Dan said, and I would underscore his comments about the West Bank. I think the West Bank has been a tinderbox for a long, long time. And the idea that this war in Gaza will continue, and Israel's army will try to root out every last Hamas soldier, it's hard to imagine that could continue for much longer without some blowback into the West Bank. It's not simply that you have a tinderbox in the West Bank, it's that you have ministers in the Israeli government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who are actually pouring gasoline on that tinderbox. So I think I would be very concerned about the future of the West Bank. About the Abraham Accords, so far the existing agreements, the existing normalizations with UAE and Morocco and Bahrain have continued. None of those countries have taken any steps to downgrade the relationship with Israel, but I think they're very much on ice. I don't think there's much more that can be accomplished, certainly not with Saudi Arabia. There was a question about whether Hamas did this to derail that agreement with Saudi Arabia. That may have been part of their thinking, although I don't think that was the main motivation. I think they've been planning this attack in Israel for a long, long time. They finally developed the capability to do it. They found the right time when they thought Israel was weak because of the debate in Israel about judicial reform and the lack of focus by Israel on what was going on in Gaza with Hamas. So I think those are more important for Hamas than the Abraham Accords as motivation for the attack.
So the rejection is low? Yes. Why don't we get back to what Dan was saying earlier about the possibility of a peace process when all the dust settles and the thinking that's going on the U.S. side now. You've written that only the U.S. can change the equation. Can you expand a little bit on why that is? And also, why is it in the U.S. interest to do so? I know that seems like an obvious question, but I think it's worth going into that a little bit deeply.
The experience we've had, the United States has had since 1991, the Madrid Peace Conference, has demonstrated time and time again that the parties to the conflict itself are not capable of doing much more than articulating old positions. You look back at the negotiations that took place after Madrid and after Oslo, and they were fairly stultified. For those of you in business or law, it would be like going into a negotiation and then coming back 2 weeks later and repeating the same issues and the same starting points, and then going away for 3 months and doing it again. Groundhog Day, definition of insanity. And so the United States has always been either called upon or has decided for itself that if we wanted the process to make progress, we would have to stimulate it. Now, we have not done a very good job over the years. I don't normally market my books, but if you want to read why we haven't done a good job, you could buy one of my books. The fact is that there were opportunities where more significant American intervention in the negotiations might have advanced the possibility of progress. I don't want to say would have led to an agreement, because there are a lot of factors that go into an agreement. But frankly, after the George H.W. Bush administration, one can go through Clinton, George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and now Biden, and be quite critical of America's stated interest in making progress toward peace, but not following it up with the kind of robust diplomacy that we are capable of, and that we demonstrated 30 years ago in bringing about Madrid and stimulating Oslo. The question David asked is exactly the question that President Biden is going to face, and frankly, it's a binary question. You know, normally in government, for those of you who've served, you always present three options. There's a bold option, there's a status quo option, and then you want the policymaker to come out somewhere in the middle. You know, you don't want too much risk, and you want to mitigate the problems. I don't think we have that option now. I think the president's going to have to make a decision to either go bold and do things that we have not done now since Madrid, or to basically say it's not the highest priority for us. Because it's a hard case to make this the highest priority when just a few minutes ago I listed some of the other priorities, which even I, a lifer when it comes to the peace process, would admit are more important than this conflict. In fact, even in the Middle East, this conflict is not the most dangerous. How many people were killed in Syria? And how many people were displaced in Syria, either internally or as refugees? How many people killed in Yemen? How many in Libya? Years ago in Algeria? I mean, we're talking about a region that consumes its people in war. And this is not the most serious war. So to make the argument to the president that he should make the binary choice of going bold means that he's going to have to do things that presidents don't like to do. Bringing pressure to bear on both sides, not just one. Offering incentives and assurances to both sides. And to do that in an election year makes that binary choice very difficult.
And just one follow-up. Who are the sides? I mean, is Hamas considered to be an interlocutor?
So the formal sides are Israel and the PLO. The Palestinian Authority is the administrative arm of the PLO, but the two sides negotiating, we hope, negotiating peace are Israel and the PLO. And the question in any negotiation is, how wide is your tent? And what do you do with stakeholders who are also spoilers? Hamas is a spoiler. You leave them out of the tent, and they do what they did on October 7th. You bring them in the tent, and they may make it worse. You don't know. We were talking today to Senator Mitchell, and let's recall that when he inherited the post of negotiating in Northern Ireland, that negotiation succeeded in large part because after failure, following failure, following failure, they opened up the tent to previous spoilers, and they ended up with the Good Friday Agreement. Now, the president has to think about that, because if in fact Israel cannot destroy Hamas, and they're still around, and if the Palestinian Authority can't govern Gaza immediately, do you then have to bring Hamas into a quote-unquote peace process? Do they want to come into a peace process, or will they undermine it? So these are tough choices for our president.
On the subject of bringing Hamas into the tent, That was actually the discussion that went on in 2006 about whether Hamas should be allowed to participate in the legislative elections. There was a debate within the Bush administration, which was not very sympathetic to anything having to do with terrorism, about whether Hamas should be allowed to participate or not. And what actually convinced the administration at that time to agree to that was Abbas, who made the argument we should bring them into the tent and defeat them politically, and because if we leave them out of the tent, they will be a spoiler. That strategy proved to be wrong. So their arguments for bringing them in, their arguments for not letting them in.
It's even more interesting because after the election, you remember President Bush said, yeah, that was a free and fair election, but we're not going to deal with them. Which you have to wonder, if it's a free and fair election, do we have a responsibility to deal with them? But then if you deal with them, have you brought the people into the tent who are going to undermine the foundation or the stakes holding up the tent?
I recall when I was on the staff of the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, Algeria had elections, and the Islamists won, and the same thing happened. We and the French basically cast our lot in with the people who decided not to let the elections rule, and the Islamists went into opposition, and they had a decade of awful savagery and violence. I think we're kind of at the end of our time, so what I'd like to just wrap up here, and then we'll go to the Allison and the question and answer period. But for 3 decades, it seems to me, rejectionists, religious and ideological extremists on both sides have successfully torpedoed Israel-Palestinian negotiations. And it's kind of the same situation now, but with one difference, and that is that the people who were the outliers 30 years ago are now running the roost on both sides. So as I said, October 7th convulsed Gaza and Israel and the Middle East and the region and the world. It's going to have long-term knock-on effects that we can only guess at. I want to thank Ambassador Kurtzer, my friends, Ambassador Kurtzer and Ambassador Wallace, for coming up here to Maine and for sharing their time and their thoughts with us. I think we're really lucky to have them here. And I hope there's so much to this question. We've kind of scratched the surface, but I hope it's helped to understand a little bit better what happened and what may or may not come next. So we look forward to your questions, and I guess it's over to Executive Director Allison Hodgkins, who's going to manage that process.
We have time for some questions. People want to put up their hand. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Zeke Williams, member of the World Affairs Council and sponsor. Ambassador Wallace, you wrote in 2010 that if the moderates could not find a way to come together, that the extremists are going to win, which you said was the worst possible outcome. You say, also paraphrasing, that the democratic issues in Iran would exploit any failure, and that we needed to push for a solution then. So would you say that this is the worst possible outcome that you had envisioned in 2010? And also, what is the United States' role in making peace with Iran, and how could that influence this process if the United States was able to, take out their influence on this situation by having some sort of sustainable peace with Iran?
Good question. I don't know what I imagined would happen. I knew something bad would happen eventually. And I'm writing that not just in 2010, I've said that more recently, that absent a process underway, try to resolve this issue, really bad would happen. Frankly, I expected the West Bank to explode before Gaza exploded, but I'm not surprised about what happened on October 7th. In terms of the Iranian role in this, The Iranians have been a big supporter of Hamas for a long, long time. They provided them money, provided them weapons, they provided them technology to manufacture weapons through the rockets in Gaza. I don't think, however, that Iran was involved in the decision. I think Hamas was the one who decided on the attack on October 7th, the timing of it. So the Iranian hand is in this spot, but they're not the ones that are driving the process. I'm not sure that solving the U.S. differences with Iran on the nuclear issue would necessarily impact significantly on the Palestinian. It might, it's hard to know exactly. There's a dynamic to the Palestinian resistance to Israel which would exist whether Iran was pushing it or not. So some progress between the U.S. and Iran might help, but it may not be the way to solve this problem.
If I could just. My button, yeah. Let me just add one thing about Iran. Based on my personal experience, I was a director for Iran and Iraq in the State Department at one point. I have seen this issue for many years. I studied Persian in the hope that one day we would have an embassy in Iran. And I think one of the tragedies in our foreign policy, one of the failures really, is that we have had no relations with Iran since 1979. And so, we have indirect channels, through other countries, and we are reduced to talking through the media. And you can't conduct any kind of an effective negotiation in public through the media. And so it always comes down to a lowest common denominator discussion, a zero-sum game. And again, the people who are the sort of spoilers on both sides, it's easy for them to, stop stuff. I remember trying to clear papers at the State Department, and we had to get, like 10 different offices to sign off, and by the time you did, the message was so watered down that, it didn't make much have much of an effect. And the same thing happens in Iran. They have a lot of different interests in their government, and the hardliners have been managed to screw things up for many, many years now. And I think it's a shame. I think that you have to negotiate with your adversaries, not with your friends. And so I'm in favor of engagement with Iran, if it's possible, but I don't know if it is.
And if Allison forgives me, I want to add something too. The one time we did negotiate with Iran was leading up to the 2015 Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, which, with all of its faults, and it had faults as an agreement, stopped the Iranian nuclear program in its tracks. And the Iranians adhered to every provision of that agreement. When we found some discrepancies, for example, in the level of enrichment or the amount of enriched uranium that was remaining in Iran, they fixed it right away. So if you then fast forward from the agreement and its adherence to that agreement, and in 2018, when the Trump administration pulled out of that agreement, and Iran is now amazingly close to being a threshold nuclear state, you can see the difference between engagement, negotiation as David suggested, and bullying, which is what we saw in the previous administration. I don't want to get political. I'm talking about the diplomatic impact of reaching an agreement with an adversary, which we did in 2015, having that agreement implemented, and then we pulled out of it, and Iran is now much closer to the breakout moment when it can decide, if it decides, to have a nuclear weapon. It's a lesson not just about Iran, but about the continuity of our foreign policy. Are we able to maintain a continuous set of American interests that can live beyond an administration of one party as we move to an administration of another party? And I'm not sure about that, but if we can't, we're going to have this ping pong diplomacy with ourselves where we have successes and then we shoot ourselves in the foot, pardon my mixed metaphors.
So Bradley Worth here at USM. I think I speak for all students when I say your careers are incredibly valuable, so thank you to all the students who are inspirational. The description you both laid out regarding the risks of long-term occupation and the lack of viability for exterminating Hamas, to me and probably others, sound really familiar to the mistakes that the U.S. made in our Middle Eastern forever wars that they've been termed now. So one question is, why has the Biden administration been less than absolute on keeping Israel from making our same mistakes? And two, if the U.S. does change course and issue advice more forcefully, how does Israel view its validity given the current condition of Afghanistan? We pulled out and it's overrun by the Taliban in 10 years. Thank you.
Nothing like giving a student for an easy question.
Can you summarize the question? 'Cause I don't think we heard it very well there.
You can hear it? It is on, isn't it?
Yeah, so I think part one is, why has the Biden administration been less than forceful in taking our lessons from the Middle East wars and conveying them to those in Israel? And then part two is, if we do change course and issue more of a hard line, don't go with the occupation, how does Israel view that, given that when we pulled out of Afghanistan, the Taliban had taken over the country again within hours?
Look, we have a long-term political security relationship with the state of Israel, existed well before October 7th. Goes back at least 40 years when we constructed a kind of strategic cooperation framework, which has benefited both of our countries. Israel has gained a great deal from us, and we've gained from Israel as well. And so several administrations have approached this issue of forcing Israel or pressuring Israel to do what we think is right with a great deal of caution. Since Israel's an ally, they're an independent democratic country, the question that administrations have asked is it our business or duty to, quote unquote, force Israel to do what the Israeli electorate has voted for or against? And successive administrations have decided that we would have conversations with Israel. Sometimes there's a little bit of nudging here and there. Sometimes there's a little bit of tough talk, but basically accepting the fact that we're dealing with an independent state. Now, if the administration decides to get tougher, because is October 7th an inflection point, which changes everything, then you will see political blowback here. It'll become an election issue, and there'll be political blowback in Israel. I heard just today, I was on a Zoom earlier today, there are significant members of the opposition in Israel, opposition to Netanyahu, who don't want American pressure. And the reason is they think that that will redound to Netanyahu's benefit. It'll solidify Netanyahu's support in his base, and it will be seen as strange on the part of others who think that we don't understand what they've just gone through. Now, I don't know if that's true, and even if it may be true, there's still a question of whether we should try to influence that segment of the population. But you can see how it's going to impact the policymakers' assessments here and make it very difficult to make that binary choice that I mentioned earlier.
Thank you. I wanted to bring up a couple of things that I think were not brought up tonight. It was kind of hinted at, but not really brought up. And one is what we've heard about the brutality of Hamas in the attack on October 7th. We haven't heard anything about the scale of destruction and killing that has gone on in Gaza in the last 2 months. We talked a lot about who's going to administer and govern Gaza, but as though Gaza doesn't have people in it, what are these people going to do? Who are they? Do they have agency? Do they have families anymore? So we didn't hear any of that. And that, in a way, is representative to me of US policy in the region towards Israel and Palestine. As you just said as well, that there is a strategic alliance and that has benefited Israel and the United States. And as usual, the Palestinians will pay the price of American election politics and Israeli election politics. I am Palestinian, my name is Fatih Hassan, and I've done human rights work all my life. I directed Al-Haq, Palestinian human rights organization, throughout the first Intifada into the mid-90s, and I was also representative of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for the Arab region. The other thing, I say that because I wanted to bring up the other thing that was not mentioned tonight, which is international law. The absolute absence of international law in your discussions. And that's been the policy of the US because it has done everything possible to protect Israel in international diplomatic forums from accountability for its impunity in how it has treated the Palestinians. I'm not only talking about the massacres going on now, but I'm talking about collective punishments, house demolitions, administrative punishments without charge and trial. I'm talking about deportations, etc., etc. You know as well as I do. But it is never part of the discussion. Why? Thank you.
There is no difference between the loss of life on both sides of this conflict. And all of us have experienced, as I mentioned in my first intervention, we are all veterans of the Second Intifada. I'm in fact older than these guys, and I'm a veteran also of the First Intifada, when I was working for Secretary of State George Shultz. There's no difference in any of our views with regard to the suffering on both sides, and I think I said that clearly. There are differences of views, however, with regard to the acts of barbarism of a terrorist organization and the effort of a state to defend itself. What the Biden administration has tried to do, unsuccessfully so far, and I say unfortunately unsuccessfully, is to rein in the choices that Israel has made to try to defend itself. And they've been unsuccessful. But the fact is there are differences between a state, a people that has been subjected to what happened on October 7th, and then the overbearing response of a state trying to defend its citizens. On the question of international law, I can't suggest what the World Affairs Council of Maine should do, but you should bring two experts on this question, as we did at Princeton, where I've been on the faculty now for 18 years. We brought the former head of Human Rights Watch, Kenneth Roth, and we brought a retired Israeli colonel from their international law department. And they discussed this issue. And it is far more nuanced than what can be determined by applause. We all want to say that the policy that our government or other governments following is adhering to international law, but international law, as you know, doesn't have firm and fast rules regarding many of these issues, regarding even hospitals, for example, regarding...
We're here to listen. We're here to listen.
I allowed you to finish. Let me just finish. International law doesn't have the firm and fast rules that we would like, where it says you may do something or you may not do something. But I suggest, since I'm not a lawyer, that you bring people here and have that debate. And I think it would be very healthy to hear, on the one side, somebody like a Kenneth Roth, who is frankly more critical than you in what he talks about when he spoke at Princeton. He's a friend of mine too. And the woman from the former colonel from the Israeli army, who was articulate and made points that need to be taken into account. So, rather than have a discussion, you are far better positioned to have that discussion than I. Have two people up on the stage and have it out with them, I think.
We might be able to arrange that. Go ahead.
Just quickly, we were talking about the second intifada. I was also a veteran of the first intifada. One of my first jobs working on this issue was overseeing American assistance programs in Gaza. So I spent a lot of time in Gaza during the first intifada. Every hospital that we've seen on TV in the past several weeks, I spent a lot of time in those hospitals. I saw the first intifada up close. And if we weren't clear enough in our earlier remarks about the tragedy of any civilian losing their lives or being injured, whether they're Israeli or Palestinian, we should have been more clear about that. But there's no reason for civilians to be dying the way they are on either side of that border. And it's a tragedy, and I hope it will end soon.
Let me pile on a little bit here. When I was studying Arabic in Tunisia, the Foreign Service Institute school there in 1987 to 1988, we took a field trip to Jordan, and I had the honor of had a stone cast at me during the first intifada. So I want you to know I was not quite as old as you, but I'm getting there. But there's something I'd like to say about the information space, because I was the UPI bureau chief in Beirut from 1976 to 79. And it was an unequal media battle. I mean, the Israelis totally dominated the narrative. The Palestinians were really not able to get heard very well. And I would just note now, apropos of the horrendous images and the destruction in Gaza, it's a very different situation now with social media and the internet. And I think that the narratives are both out there now in a way that they weren't before. And I'll just mention one thing. I remember trying to, in my own way, to cover the Palestinian side of the conflict, because I remember when the bureau chief, Israel would raid into South Lebanon, and the Tel Aviv bureau chief would get a canned thing from the IDF at 7 o'clock in the morning, and it wouldn't change all day long. It might not be the whole story, but it was consistent and it was all true. I called up WAFA and my contacts in the PLO and tried to get something from them, and honestly, it was just awful. They would tell me stuff that wasn't true. They would, because they felt they had to say something. By mid-afternoon, I had a better, more complete story of what actually happened, but guess what? When that reached American editors, paragraph 1 was the Tel Aviv report, and paragraph 2 or 3 was what I sent in. Now, I'll just mention one other thing, and that was, this would have been, I guess, in 1977 or 78. We heard reports that the Israelis were shelling Tyre. And I went down there with a photographer and a cameraman, and we watched the first Israeli air raids in South Lebanon in what then had been for quite a few years. And I went over to the Palestinian Red Crescent Hospital afterwards, and I saw this man wandering around like a robot, and he was kind of covered with dust, and he just wasn't focused. He was just sort of drifting down the hall. So I followed him, and he went to a room at the far end of the hospital, and in that room, there were the bodies of his wife, his 5 or 6 children, his brother's wife, and their children. And he bent over the body of the youngest one, of his kids, and he said, Yalla Habibi Ma'alesh Allahu Akbar, which means, darling, no, it doesn't matter, God is great. The next day, I wrote that story, and I think it was the National Arab American Association. Somebody took a full-page ad in the New York Times saying, Arabs are people too. And I think that now is not in question the way it was back then. Because I think that the power of the media is coming through. The fact that all of you are here, I think is indicative of the way that this story, this sad story, this tragic story has unfolded. And so I think that's good in a way, but in a way it also makes it more difficult because, as you all know, in this age of information, there's also a lot of disinformation. So sometimes things take a while to sort out, but I do think that nobody has a monopoly on the narrative anymore.
You have a question, right?
Yeah, I'm going to give another statement. I cannot make a statement, which strikes me as odd. I'm a professor emeritus at the University of Southern Maine, and it's very odd for me to know that in a university setting, we cannot ask questions of our distinguished guests. We cannot make statements to them, we can only ask questions. Be that as it may, I'm going to still make one statement and then a question. Yeah, okay. That'll be a brief statement. What I've heard tonight is from two of our ambassadors some interest in nuance. From Ambassador Walls, I don't think he's been very interested in nuance. I learned some years ago that there was another narrative to be told, and I'm glad, Ambassador Perch, that you've mentioned this. But I didn't know that narrative until 20 years ago when I began studying it. Tonight, what we've heard is pretty much coming from the Israeli side of the narrative. And if I had time, I would list off all the areas in which you've been not really given the other side. So my question is, and it's really to the World Affairs Council of Maine, when are you going to have an event here, maybe in this auditorium, and I can provide you, I'll provide you money to help fund it. I will provide you names, but we need to have some people here who will talk about Hamas, who will talk about the Palestinian Authority, who will talk about what happened in 2006. Yes, and it's a very different story from what Ambassador Walls has spoken of tonight. I want to know when we'll have that narrative told, because it needs to be told as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We do all kinds of programming, and we want to hear all perspectives, which is important. I'm going to give the last question to a woman because we haven't heard very much from them this evening. Sarah?
Thank you, Allison. I'm Sarah Beecher, and I'm a member of the board of the World Affairs Council and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. And I just want to refer back to an editorial that President Biden put in the Washington Post a little bit ago, where he said that a ceasefire is not the same as peace. And as you know, many international organizations are calling for a ceasefire. And so my question is, why isn't the U.S. supporting a ceasefire? Was that statement just about supporting Israel, or do we actually believe that the military campaign is achieving any objective?
We go first. I try to be more nuanced than this. I think I said earlier, although I don't remember exactly, that I don't think Israel can achieve its objective of destroying Hamas. That I think Israel needs to recalibrate its military objectives and its goals in this war and develop an exit strategy. I don't know why, I can't really speak on behalf of the Biden administration. Personally, I believe that the loss of life in Gaza right now is out of proportion to the military objective that Israel is trying to accomplish. As I said, Israel needs to find a way out of this, or it's going to go on a long time, and it's going to ultimately be bound against Israel. As I mentioned in a comment by Secretary of Defense Austin, that about winning the tactical battle on the battlefield and losing the war strategically. I think that's what Israel is facing.
Yeah, none of us here is a spokesperson for the Biden administration, so it's hard to interpret the thinking behind that. If I tried to, I think there were probably two motivations. Number one, as Jake indicated earlier, in addition to dealing with the threat that Hamas poses and continues to pose, they are the hostages. And would a ceasefire, this is a question, would a ceasefire enhance the prospect of bringing more hostages out? The Biden administration worked very hard for what turned out to be a 6 or 7 day humanitarian quote-unquote pause, during which a number of hostages were released until Hamas changed the rules and would not release the remaining women hostages for reasons we don't know. So one factor may be that the administration may believe that the ceasefire before there are hostage deals, and there will be many deals. There will be some related to the remaining women and some of the children and elderly who are in, and others related to Israeli citizens of military age. I think the second factor may have been the fact that the president supports the idea of debilitating Hamas, even if he does not support the way Israel is going about doing that. Let's be honest with ourselves. We spent 18 years going after terrorists in Afghanistan. They attacked us. We retaliated with the objective of ending the possibility of the Taliban and its ilk, doing it again. And so I think somewhere in the back of the president's mind may be this idea that give Israel a chance to further debilitate Hamas without supporting the way Israel is going about. The administration has been firm in its rhetoric against Israeli bombing in this urban area. The Israelis haven't listened to us, have not paid attention to what we've argued. Other than that, I also wrote a piece which explained, I think it was in foreign policy, that a ceasefire in a situation where you don't have equal parties who can adhere to a ceasefire and be monitored and held accountable presents a particular challenge to governments. So if Israel were fighting Lebanon, 2 states can make a decision to have a ceasefire. You set up a monitoring mechanism that has an accountability, and there are consequences for violation. What do you do when you have a state and a non-state actor, and you don't have the same relative equality with respect to responsibility? And it's a hard decision or a hard choice to make when you're talking about a unilateral ceasefire. If Israel tomorrow, let's say, declared a ceasefire, would we expect Hamas to reciprocate? And frankly, would we believe Hamas if they said that they reciprocated, given the at least 2 or 3 year deception that they practiced leading up to October 7th? So there are fundamental issues here, and again, I don't know what's behind the Biden op-ed or even behind the policy, but it's not a simple question, which I think has seized the public mind. We see the horror that Israeli military activities are inflicting upon Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and our first inclination is to say stop, and it's not so simple. And it's not necessarily a pro-Israel knee-jerk reaction. It's a much more fundamental question, which we also faced as a country in dealing with terrorism directed against us.
If I can find my button, okay. Seems to be a recurring motif here. Let me just repeat what Dan and Jacob said. We've all been in policy discussions in Washington. They're sometimes complicated, infernally complicated. Very often the options you have are between bad and worse, not between good and bad, but nothing is good, and you take the least worst. And particularly when a situation is breaking like this and evolving daily, it's really hard. And when you want to maintain your ability to have leverage and influence in the future, maybe you don't. Maybe you pull some of your punches up front so that you can throw those punches later when they count more. I don't know. But one thing is sure, and that is that the longer this awful violence goes on, the worse it's going to be. And it's going to be worse for Israel, it's going to be worse for us. But I think the administration knows that perfectly well, and they're making the best choices they can at a time when there are really no good choices.
Okay. First of all, I'd just like to wrap up and thank our participants. And Ambassador Kurtzer, Ambassador Wallace, and our son of Maine, Ambassador Pierce, thank you very much. It was a very enlightening evening, and I think we've learned a lot, and let's hope that we can have richer and additional discussions in the future. National security begins with a strategy, which is sort of the job of the executive branch, but it is carried out by people like this, who spent, I think each of them spent around 37 years as Foreign Service officers. I, in my time, ran across them professionally, and we need to support our diplomatic corps, and I think 2 or 3 of them mentioned in the evening that a lot of this, if we were a little bit more proactive and had stronger support and a good strategy that was continuous from administration to administration, we may have been able to preclude some of this. So I think what the World Affairs Council is doing, and most importantly, my last point is having an engaged America, every citizen engaged in understanding what's going on. We ultimately have a choice in what the strategy will be and the diplomacy will be about, and that's who we put in office. So these are very important things to be informed, and I think the energy within the World Affairs Council of Maine now and the kinds of programs we're bringing and the number of people that showed up here tonight and the passion about this issue is a very good sign for the future. And so, Allison, I'd like to thank you and the World Affairs Council. I'd like to thank the Jellin Foundation for their work and the fact that we have 2 of their 3, I think, advisors here, or their directors for the foundation. Thank you very, very much. And there's a quote that's attributed to several people, but it goes something like this, and I'm saying it in regards to the United States. We may not be interested in the war, but the war is interested in you. And I would say that, as was mentioned at the very beginning, about the only world power right now that has to throw weight to have an impact on most of the issues affecting international security issues around the world, from Ukraine, the Middle East, and what's going on in the Western Pacific is the United States. So a good way to start is that informed citizenry that you're all about here this evening. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Member of the World Affairs Council of Maine, get on the website, sign up, and become a member.
There are flyers outside that you can pick up and scan. That was his job.